Hi all, it's Phil here. Now today we will be delving deep into Antarctic history as we interview a man called Ron Wiggins. Ron was down in Wilkes Base in 1965 and along with the team was tasked with building the Casey station. Then in 1969 he was down again to complete the task, and Ron was the man who turned off Wilkes Base for good. So settle back, relax, as Peter Niblett interviews Ron Wiggins.
Okay, welcome ladies and gentlemen to another one of our special podcasts of Phil's Antarctic Expeditions. We have a very special guest with us now, Mr.
Ron Wiggins.
Ron Wiggins. And he's going to talk to us about his experiences in the 1960s in Antarctica.
In 1965 at the old American Wilkes Base.
That's correct.
And then when we started to build Casey Base, which was called Repstat in those days, replacement station, we started to build that in 1965. And then I returned back down there in 1969 for the opening of Casey Base. Which was all gone now, of course. It's all been carved up and gone away, and a new base has been built once again since then. But
in the same sort of location?
Yes.
Did you have a ribbon to cut?
Just a little bit over the hill, but yeah, pretty close to where the original Casey Base was built in with the opening in 1969.
So when you do an opening, just as a how do they do that? Because this is Australian style. You know, you just a couple of beers and
all stand out the front, and the official opening, the official naming of Casey, because up until then it had been called Repstat. Yep. It wasn't called Casey. So in February 1969, after the dramas of getting in there, being locked in the ice for quite a long period of time, in which we actually lost one of the crew members. One of the crew members was killed on board while we were sitting there. The Americans came in with the icebreaker, the Coast Guard Southwind. Southwind came and got us into the base there, and the official opening of Casey Base in February of 1969.
So, sorry, let's talk about what sort of era, what sort of time frame we're talking about. When did you start to think about it?
At some point, I must have come across an ad in the paper.
So how old were you about this time? Sort of in your mid
20s? 27, round about.
And you're a fully qualified diesel?
Just a mechanic. You didn't really specify that in those days.
Yep.
So, and one of the things I'd found out while I was up there was a guy called Pappy Redfern, and Pappy had done a couple of trips to Macquarie Island, and somehow or other I came across Pappy Redfern and having a chat with him, and he probably sparked a bit of an interest in the Antarctic, and I come across the paper, the ad in the paper, so I got in touch with the Antarctic Division, and they sent over a performer to fill in, so I filled in this form and sent it off. That's the end of that. Nothing's going to happen there. And it was some weeks later that a more specified form came in, and it was about 10 pages. And I couldn't remember what I'd written on the first, and we didn't have photocopies. Obviously, I enhanced it a little bit, I'm guessing, and I've got an idea that Pappy Redfern might have actually sent a letter over to the Antarctic Division. He was a bit of a hopeless pisspot, was old Pappy. Occasionally, he used to have a fairly serious weekend, and I remember going out to Warrawagine at one stage in the piece because the power plant stopped working out there. And when I got out there, it was pretty simple. The damn thing had run out of diesel, and nobody knew how to bleed to get it going.
You had to bleed all the
drove all the way out there the weekend, bled the thing out, cranked it over, and away it went. The power plant was starting again. But it was interesting because he was the guy who actually ran the station was an ex-English type guy, and you wouldn't believe it. Saturday at lunchtime out there, everybody's dressed up for lunch.
Gee.
Two native girls.
Mad dog Englishmen.
Two native girls were sitting in the background, and they brought in the leg of lamb, and he carved the leg of lamb. Next thing I know, I was asked for a medical, which we passed. Wasn't a real problem at that stage in the piece, and then they got in touch with me and said, here's a plane ticket. Come down to Perth, and I was interviewed by Don Stiles, who was the assistant director at the time, and I thought that's the end of that.
Yeah, but that's quite a high up sort of person to be interviewing.
Yeah, well,
isn't it?
they used to fly, and I don't know how many other people he would have interviewed, but he probably would have come over. He might have had 4 or 5 people that he needed to interview, and so they flew down on the F-27 down to Perth, did the interview and got on the plane and flew back up north. I thought, well, that will be the end of that. So next thing I know, I'd been accepted, and you say when we were talking earlier on, you begin to wonder, they only required 7 mechanics in those days. How in the hell did they manage to pick a guy from Derby? I guess they're looking for people who haven't spent their life sitting in a city.
Yeah, and like you said, has that experience to go, I can see the problem, that's easy, fix that.
Next thing I know, I've plane ticket once again, so I've come down from Derby down to Perth and arranged the insurances and driver's licence and paid everything for 2 years in advance, sort of thing, which is what you had to do. And then I flew over to Melbourne and started with the Antarctic Division in 568 St Kilda Road, Melbourne, with a bunch of guys. Yeah,
it's just like a recruiting army recruit. You go and do boot camp.
You all arrived there on that first day, and everybody's looking at everybody saying, "Who's this bloke?"
And I suppose you're all clean shaven at that time.
All clean shaven.
You look suntanned and everything else.
Yeah. Oh, I might have had a bit of suntan having come from Derby.
That's exactly right. You know.
But to a cold winter, though, September would have been early September. I was pretty lucky. I don't know. I ended up working with the crew. They had a very good engineering laboratory downstairs with lathes and milling machines and all that sort of thing. And I was kept busy the whole time we were in Melbourne, working in that laboratory down there, making stuff, because especially in those days, nothing was made to work in the Antarctic.
Yeah.
So you brought something and you modified it so you could use it in the cold weather. At that stage in the piece, they were very interested in putting remote weather stations in. And they looked just a square box, and we built some fans to pump the air through these things. And I was building the fan blades. The first time I did a lot to do with welding and all that sort of thing, or bronzing. It was the Weather Bureau put these things out in the middle of no man's land down there, and unfortunately what happened was that they had lead acid batteries in them, and because they were pretty much a box, they were using these to charge the batteries.
Yeah.
So the buildings got full of hydrogen.
Oh,
and most of them exploded.
Oh, that's a good experience in itself, isn't it?
But so I spent all my time downstairs working down there. But apart from going out and doing going out for your weekend camp to make sure that you all knew how to hang onto a rope and all that sort of thing, and put up a tent and living on HF6 bars and all that sort of. No matter what you do with that stuff, you can put all the curry you like in there and it still tasted bloody terrible. Luckily, the crew that I was with, we had a couple of guys that had been down before and they knew what the story was, so we had a good supply of alternate food while we were on the camp.
Because it was all like ration packs, isn't it? And they just taste like shit.
Yeah, if you had to, you would eat it, but you'd really have to be really hungry to eat some of that stuff that they... ration packs that they had. And,
so your initial training would have been about 3 months just to get yourself ready?
Yeah, we usually used to, early September was when they would normally go in, and then you were leaving in the end of December, or in our case it was early January.
Yeah, because that's the peak time for working down there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everything
Well,
gets
that's
transferred
with the
down.
changeover. Obviously, got to do that changeover during that summer period. So so you did all the courses that you need to do. We went out to the Caterpillar people.
Oh, yeah.
We went out and spent a few days with them, having a look at one of the tractors that was going to go down that had just been repaired. We spent 2 weeks with the Department of Civil Aviation on gensets, on coupling up gensets so you could run more than one genset if you needed external power supply. So we spent 2 weeks at the Moorabbin Airport down there with DCA and different other organisations. You'd go and spend a couple of days relating to equipment that you were going to use to become familiar.
Yeah, have to cross a lot of things because once you're down there, you can't just say, I don't know how to do that.
You can't ring up from down there and those. Well, in actual fact, we did have a phone there at Wilkes in those days, And next thing we know, we're on the Thala.
The Thala Dam?
Or waving goodbye on the Thala or from the wharf in Melbourne there. But a lot of the people, of course, weren't from Melbourne. So we had Queenslanders, we had West Australians, we had Tasmanians, so you had all this crew. And local people were on the wharf to see their father, husband, or whatever it might be off. I had nobody, of course. We had some French guys with us, so we headed straight down to Dumont-Deville. And drops, I think there's about 7 French guys that we had at Dumont-Deville, and then we took off from there because we were building Repstat, replacement station, which was, of course, to become Casey.
That was your principal job, going down to do that?
Yes, so we headed off, and the pack was a bit thick. They had a couple of tries to get into Wilkes, so they said, oh look, both boats were going to go round to Davis. Obviously a shortage of money at that stage in the piece, so the decision was made to close, close Davis Station down for a few years. So we went into Davis Station and winterised all the gensets and all that sort of thing. The snow track, that was loaded on to go down to Mawson, and they had a Fergie tractor and trailer that went on the boat to go down to Mawson and all that sort of thing. So we loaded that down, shut down the Davis base, and then went back to Wilkes to do the same.
Did you have a barge sort of thing to drive these tractors on and take them to the boat, or could you get quite close in?
Rubber pontoon.
Oh, so you blew them up?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, the big rubber pontoons with planks across them.
Yep.
And we loaded the D4s, we loaded all the stuff on rubber pontoon. Later on we had barges, but in those days we had 2 big rubber army pontoons with a plank across them. Very hair-raising, I can assure you.
So how did you have an outboard or something, or you just drag them ashore with a rope? Or?
No, we used to use the little Anari, the little Anari 2, a little wooden boat that they had.
Okay.
They'd just strap that alongside it and drive it in, take it ashore there. And we had the D4, we had another D4.
Because that'd be a bit hairy actually driving that onto a pontoon.
Everything rocks around and and then take it ashore. And then we had to, because they had a drilling platform that they'd taken down there, which wasn't successful. And that was my first trip up onto the plateau. They had this drilling platform up there, and I went up there. It was a rotary type drill, which wasn't successful. It used to keep jamming, so.
Because they were drilling into the ice.
Ice, yeah.
Like ice cores and things like that.
Yeah, they're taking ice cores, yeah. And so somebody said, oh look, this has got to go back to Melbourne. Can you go up and get it? And it was an unusual structure in that it had big tanks on the side as runners, and they were for storing the fuel in. But the trouble is, this thing used to wander around wherever it felt. There was nothing to guide it with these big flat tanks. There was 2 tanks, they were about 15, 18 foot long and about 2 foot wide on both sides, with this drilling rig mounted in the middle of it.
It's like a catamaran, but sort of nothing to hold it in.
I'm coming down off the plateau, and next thing I know, the drilling rig's in front and I'm behind going down backwards.
Where's the anchors when you need it? Yeah.
This is the introduction to the Antarctic, fellas.
Yeah. What can go wrong will go wrong. Yeah.
But
how did you stop it then? How do you stop something like that?
You don't. You just keep going backwards until it levels out.
Okay. Yeah, well, I suppose that's it.
Probably 2 or 3 kilometres back. Down the hill I went. Big learning experience.
Yeah.
But so that was the sort of thing. So it was eventually put on the pontoon and taken back out to the ship there.
So it could take quite a bit of stuff, that ship. I mean, I thought it was about 7,000 tonne or 10,000 tonne ship. So it's not that big.
No, they're not that big, but they were absolutely marvellous, those ships, the Danish ships. There's no 2 ways about it.
And they're still run by the Danish crews?
Yes, the Danish Lauritsen lines, the Thala and the Nella. I say the Thala was the only one that I'd actually travelled on. I'd been on the Nella while it was in Melbourne, but I never travelled on the Nella. And the Nella was a little bit bigger than the Thala, because the Nella was the last of those boats that they actually built for Lauritsen lines.
So just going back a bit, how was the trip down? Because you can get pretty hairy on those things because they're not very well stable.
They were rather small, and part of the problem was that the accommodation, they didn't have a big enough accommodation block on them. So by the time we had our crew, the 24 of us that were to stay at Wilkes, there was 3, 4, 5 blokes from head office to look after things, make sure that the things were going well there. And then we had the larkies, the duck guys, so we had the ducks on board, most of the cargo. And then we had the 7 guys, the Frenchies. So we had 3 guys in pretty much every cabin sleeping on the floor. In a sleeping bag type of arrangement.
And bouncing around in the seas.
It was a little bit better, of course, once we offloaded some at the French base. When you a couple of days out of Melbourne, there was plenty of room when you were having meals, that's for sure. It wasn't until you got into the ice, oh, who's this bloke? I haven't seen him before.
There's a big difference is when you get into the ice because everything sort of settles down.
Everything just levels out. It's nice and flat and easy, and icebergs start appear, and oh, who's this bloke? I haven't seen him before. He'd been in the boat for the last 10 days almost. Come up occasionally, but yeah, they could roll. They could roll those boats. But,
I suppose once you get in the ice, you got the sound effect of the grind in the ice as you're going through.
On the way through, and backwards and forwards, trying to push your way through the ice. It wasn't too bad on the first trip. On the second trip in '69, we ended up spending, I think, 24 or 25 days stuck in the ice.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Of course, this was to open the new Casey, Rexstat as it was called, but what became Casey Station. We were to open this new base, and we had all this gear on board.
All the politicians turning up?
We had, yes, sir. No, that we had a politician on board. We must have had some sort of politicians on board there, but yeah. And so they got the south wind in, the American icebreaker. Coast Guard brought the south wind in, and he broke us out. And he said, we'll give you 4 days, after that we're leaving. And so all this gear we had for this brand new base that was being opened had to be unloaded in 4 days. So we worked literally 24 hours a day. And the Americans were great. They had their big helicopters up, carting equipment. So it was the first time that we had big steel tanks for our fuel to be pumped ashore. At the old Wilkes base, we had rubber pillow tanks.
Oh, okay, so just
inflated tanks. So they were just sitting in a rack, and they pumped the fuel ashore. And we only had enough fuel almost to get us halfway through the year. So we had to download 800 drums of fuel in the middle of winter at the old Wilkes base, whereas at the new Casey base we had these steel tanks to pump all the fuel ashore.
So why was the new Casey base built? You know, you'd had a couple of smaller bases. Mawson's been there for a long time.
Mawson and Davis. Basically because Wilkes base, it was built for IGY 87, 88.
What's IGY?
International Geophysical Year.
Okay.
That was the massive thing. The Americans especially got stuck into the International Geophysical Year, and they built Wilkes base, and it was only to run for 2-3 years. Wow. And they were prepared to abandon it.
Yeah.
And then Phil Law said, well, hang on, it's another base there. Can we have it? So the Americans handed Wilkes base across to Australia in 1959. So we had a part of American, part Australian crew in 1959, and unfortunately that was the year that Hartley Robinson got run over by a tractor down there. So the first year they had a very bad start down there. And the other unfortunate part was that the other mechanic ended up being locked up for most of the year. He had serious mental problems.
Really?
Yes.
It's interesting how it affects people, because I think when Phil went down there, day one, they were literally had almost an attempted murder, as doing the handover. So there's sort of, it does affect people in different ways.
Oh, it does. To say, when we went in '65, our electrician, he took one lap ashore with the first ducks that went in there, found out that the place was virtually almost underground. And the problem was that they were all wooden buildings, wooden panels were put up, and all the heating for the base was done through fuel. It had big oil radiators, had about 30 of them spread throughout the thing. So twice a week it was my job at that stage in the piece to refuel the gensets. So we had 2 gensets in the workshop, and we had 3 in the powerhouse. So we had 2 systems running all the time. They were independent systems, so we had to keep them. And then we had to refuel all of these tanks that were under the ice. We never ever seen the tanks, so we had a piping system across the roof, so you'd go along independent of weather, usually crawling along, especially if the wind was blowing, and you'd open the tap and you'd quickly shut off the tap, but occasionally a bit of fuel would spill over the top. So all that fuel was sitting there, and in the summertime when the level of the water came up in the buildings, because we had pumps in a lot of the buildings to keep the water out of them, all that diesel fuel had soaked all of those buildings. It was a massive fire hazard.
Stink as well.
Because it was underground, if a fire started, the whole base would have gone. There was no way of stopping a fire. We had massive fire extinguishers everywhere, but you would never have stopped it. And that would have been the end of the base. So fire was an absolute nightmare, especially if the fire alarms went off, and a couple of occasions that did happen, the fire alarm went off, and it's an absolute panic. So twice a week it was my job to get up and go along the top of the roof, turn the tap on, fill the tanks up to supply all the fuel. So the electrician, he took one look and said, sorry, I'm not staying here, and he went back on the ship. BP supplied the fuels for the stations in those days. I don't know who does it nowadays, but they used to make what they call an Antarctic blend.
Oh.
So it's a slightly more refined, so we had a special, for want of a better word, special fuel. And of course, when we're out in the field, we used aviation turbine kerosene. We even had that in the radio. We didn't use water in the radiators of the D4s down there.
So you really were in a complete combustible environment.
In actual fact, the work or the office as such, if we would call it an office that we had for the mechanical guys down there, was a padded cell. And that's where, in '59, that's where the guy spent most of his year. The Russians did fly a doctor in and to do an assessment on him, and the military said keep him in there as long. He wasn't seriously bad. He would come out occasionally. And
he was psychotic or something? He was just
Just,
off balance.
Oh yeah, seriously off balance. And so they kept him locked up most of the time until the flying season started, September, October, and the Americans came in and flew him out. It was unfortunate that they only had two mechanical. Of course, Hartley was run over, so that was one mechanic gone. And the other guy spent most of his year in a padded cell.
Wow. So you need to talk about the flying seasons. Obviously, did they bring any aircrafts down on the ship?
No. In the very early stuff, when they first started Mawson, they had DC-3s and they had Osters and all that sort of thing. But in our year, in '65, when we first went in, we didn't even have a helicopter on board. Yeah. But the Americans and that were flying in 1961. In November '61, they flew a plane into Wilkes there. They'd been over to Murney, and from Murney they came across to Wilkes, and they flew in there. Had a bit of a party overnight, of course. Went up the next morning, and unfortunately on the takeoff, she caught fire and burned up, wrecked the plane.
Oh my God. But they would be landing on it basically just as minimally
on skis. No, it was a Neptune. It was a Neptune that they did. They just landed up on the plateau, and unfortunately 4 guys died, 5 survived in that one, and we were lucky that we got most of it on film. The guy who was a camera operator that year had most of it. Unfortunately, you see the plane take off and you see it burst into flame out the back. When they were actually refuelling the plane, he mentioned that there was fuel coming out the back of the hull, and the guy said, oh, that's normal. Once again, they had pillow tanks inside the plane to give them the range. And obviously, when they hit the JATO bottles, take off.
Yeah, because he's a rocket.
Yeah, they had the JATO bottles to get them off the ground as he caught fire. And you see a massive burst of flame at the back of it, and unfortunately that's where he ran out of fuel. A couple of days later they flew a Herc in from McMurdo to pick the guys up, pick up the bodies and to take the guys back. They all got burned a little bit, but they were quite
lucky to survive.
Yeah.
Ones that did.
Yeah. So I've got some shots of parts of the plane. You can still see parts of the plane in '65 when I was down there, but it's a very, very dangerous place to be flying down there. Some of the stuff that the Americans did down there.
We sort of have an idea of what the Australian bases look like. You know, pretty rough and, you know, a few bits here,
we had the cream.
And then you got the Russian base, which is massive.
Nightmare.
Yeah.
From what the Australians told us of it.
Yeah, well, that's what Phil said. He did a visit there and it was just so enormous.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Americans who just literally have everything that you could possibly want.
We were absolutely amazed when we took over Wilkes there. I think they had originally, reckoned that they were going to put 2 bases in. So there was one at Wilkes and they were going to put another one somewhere else, but they ran out of time, shipping problems and all that sort of thing. So they ended up, the food, etc., that they unloaded at Wilkes was mind-boggling, because we were still using it in 65. We were still using it in 69. Because of the problems going in 1969, being stuck in the ice and all that, what happened is that all the transmitters and that couldn't be put in because we only had that 4-day changeover. I ended up going back to Wilkes Base, and I stayed at, in 69, I stayed at Wilkes until I think it was the 9th of April in 1969. I actually shut down Wilkes Base, so we had Wilkes Base and the new Casey Base running, and we were transferring all the equipment, machinery and all that sort of thing that we needed out of the old Wilkes Base across to...
Well, you've done that on sleds?
On sleds, yeah. All your spare parts, all your fuel, everything loaded on there. And I think in 65 we had 40 drums of fuel. We had 2 tons of explosives sitting on top of that. And the worst part was that unfortunately the generator on my D4 failed, so I didn't have power. So we had a little portable generator sitting on top of this load of dynamite with a cable running forward to the cab. You have to keep your batteries well and truly charged up.
Why would you need so much explosives?
We were doing geophysical work. In those days you couldn't fly over and do your geophysical work, so we were drilling a hole, putting the geophones out, doing the explosion and getting this, and it was all recorded photographically. So you develop the film, and that's how we actually ended up doing all the So we were going right down to the Vandervoort Glacier. So we went right over the top of the Vandervoort Glacier, determining the actual depth of ice that were there.
And what did you get any idea of how deep?
Oh yeah, we were about 3,000 feet above sea level when we were over the Vandervoort Glacier. There was about 12,000 feet of ice below us.
Wow, it's extraordinary.
And when you got into the valley, and it was unusual because the Vandervoort, at that stage in the piece, they reckoned it was probably the fastest glacier on the Antarctic continent. It could move up to 6 feet a day.
A day?
A day. The guy who was with us doing our geophysical work, he ended up going right down in amongst all, you've got chunks of ice the size of houses, and he went down in amongst them to get some ice samples that thousands of years old, and this it's crunching and grinding and carrying
and
on.
It's moving, like you said.
They reckon it has moved as fast as 6 feet a day. But whereas you're normally talking inches, it's very, very small.
Inches every year.
The big one. It's only a very, very small one, but it was
a lot of pressure.
It was interesting that with the Nuyina, the new ship, when they had her down there for that first year, she did a lot of work actually reading underneath the Vandervoort Glacier.
Doing a sort of sonar.
They are now able to go a couple of kilometres from the face underneath the iceberg and measure, how much of it's floating, how much of it's sitting on the ground. It was quite interesting.
So that's around the Casey region, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because we'll get Phil to do a map of that.
Yes.
So now let's just geographically, where is Casey in relation to Australia? Because we know Mawson's more towards Madagascar.
Casey is more or less directly below Perth.
Perth. Perth.
Due south of Perth,
okay.
You're heading Casey Station.
Right. And Wilkes is...
Well, Wilkes, Casey, it's the same. They're only a couple of kilometres apart. When we first, because we actually in '65 we started the build of Casey, well, Repstat as it was called. We started the build in '65.
Folks, if you like these videos, it would be a great encouragement to us if you would hit the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you.